Imagine a child's world shattered not by a monster in the dark, but by the one person who was supposed to be their light. Imagine being told you are a burden, then thrown into a merciless world with nothing but your sibling's hand to hold. You probably think you'd give up. Most would. But this is not a story about giving up. It is a story about a melody born from pain, a song that refused to be silenced. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. The rain fell in cold, angry sheets, plastering 10-year-old Lena's thin dress to her skin. Her twin brother, Leo, stood beside her, his small body a fragile shield against the wind that whipped through the narrow, unlit alley. They weren't crying. The time for tears had passed an hour ago, back in the one-room apartment that was no longer their home. The final image was seared into their minds. Their mother, Maria, her face a mask of bitter resentment, pointing a trembling finger towards the door. "Get out," she had screamed, her voice cracking with a pain so deep it had curdled into cruelty. "You are the biggest burden of my life. I wish you were never born." Her words were a physical blow, harder than any slap. She had thrown their single, shared school bag onto the muddy street, followed by a small, worn-out blanket. Then she had slammed the door, the sound of the bolts sliding into place, echoing louder than the thunder outside. It was the sound of their world ending. They now huddled together in the doorway of a closed tailor shop, the faint light from a distant street lamp casting long, dancing shadows around them. Leo shivered, not just from the cold, but from the raw, gnawing emptiness in his stomach. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the only thing of value he owned in the world, a small, silver harmonica. It had belonged to their grandfather, a gentleman who smelled of wood smoke and told stories of mischievous forest spirits. He had given it to Leo just before he died. "Music can find light in the darkest of places, my boy," he had said. "Never forget that." Lena leaned her head against Leo's shoulder, her own shivering starting to subside into a numb cold. She didn't mean it, did she? "Leo," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. "Mama still loves us, right?" Leo looked at his sister, at her wide, hopeful eyes, and felt a surge of something fierce and protective. He was the quiet one, the observer, while Lena was the dreamer, the one whose voice could mimic the birds in the morning. He couldn't protect her from the rain, or the hunger, or the crushing weight of their mother's words. But he could give her a song. He brought the cold harmonica to his lips. He wasn't a prodigy, just a boy who had found solace in melody. He played a soft, simple tune, a melody he'd made up himself. It was a sad tune, filled with the ache of the storm both outside and inside their hearts. But it was also a promise that as long as they had each other, they were not truly alone. As the lonely notes of the harmonica drifted into the rain-soaked night, Lena closed her eyes. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. But she wasn't thinking of their mother anymore. She was listening to her brother's music, a tiny spark of light in an overwhelming darkness. Their mother, Maria, was a woman broken by life. Her husband, a charming musician with promises as smooth as his melodies, had walked out a year ago, leaving behind nothing but a mountain of debt and 2 children who had his eyes. She worked double shifts at a local canteen, her hands raw from washing dishes, her spirit eroded by the constant struggle. Every time she looked at her children, she saw a reflection of her failed dreams, of the man who had abandoned her. The love she once had for them had been choked by the weeds of bitterness and despair. The landlord's final warning had been the last straw. The eviction notice, a stark white paper nailed to their door, had been her breaking point. In her shattered mind, it wasn't her failure, it was theirs. They were the anchor weighing her down. So she cut the rope. As she sat alone in the now silent room, the rain beating against the tin roof, Maria did not feel relief. She felt nothing. The space where love for her children used to be was now just a hollow, aching void. She didn't know, and couldn't have cared less, that miles away, her son was playing a melody of survival, and her daughter was listening, gathering the strength that would one day change all of their lives. The twins, cast out and invisible, were about to find a stage bigger than they could ever imagine. And their first song was one of pure, heartbreaking survival. The first night on the streets was a lesson in survival. The tailor shop's doorway offered little protection from the biting wind that followed the rain. Leo and Lena huddled together under their single, damp blanket. The city's indifferent hum, a constant, lonely companion. Morning came not with the smell of their mother's pap, but with the harsh glare of sunlight on concrete and the sharp, gnawing pain of hunger. They learned quickly. They learned which street vendors would shoo them away and which ones might offer a bruised banana. They learned to make themselves small, invisible. Two little ghosts haunting the edges of a world that had no space for them. Their only currency was their music. It started out of desperation. One afternoon, sitting near the bustling Oshodi market, Lena began to sing, her voice a quiet, mournful thread in the tapestry of market noise. Leo, seeing a woman pause to listen, hesitantly brought the harmonica to his lips. He played the simple, sad tune from the night of the storm. The melody, born of heartbreak, was surprisingly beautiful. It rose above the shouts of the traders and the rumbling of the buses, a pure, clear sound that cut through the chaos. People stopped. A trader selling oranges, a bus driver waiting for passengers, a young student with a heavy backpack. They didn't see two dirty street kids. They heard a story. Lena's voice was raw, filled with an emotion far beyond her years, and Leo's harmonica was its perfect, soulful echo. That day, they made 300 naira, enough for 2 plates of jollof rice and a bottle of water to share. It was the first full meal they'd had in days. Music became their lifeline. They found a regular spot under the pedestrian bridge, a place where the acoustics amplified their sound. Lena's voice grew stronger, more confident, and Leo's melodies became more complex, weaving tales of hope and loss without a single word. They became a small, local phenomenon. The Oshodi twins, whose music could make you stop, listen, and for a moment, feel something real. It was on another rainy afternoon, a week after they were thrown out, that their world changed again. The sky had opened up suddenly, sending people scrambling for cover. Leo and Lena were huddled under the flimsy awning of a closed kiosk, soaked and shivering. Most people rushed past, but one man stopped. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with kind, weary eyes and a face that held the ghost of 1,000 melodies. He wasn't dressed like a rich man. He wore simple trousers and a faded traditional shirt. He stood in the rain, listening, as Lena sang and Leo played, their music a fragile candle against the storm. When they finished, the man didn't just drop a few coins. He walked over to them, his expression one of profound, thoughtful sadness. "That song," he said, his voice a low, gentle baritone. "Where did you learn it?" Leo shrugged. "I just made it up." The man knelt, bringing himself to their level. His name was Tunda, though they didn't know it yet. He had once been one of Nigeria's most respected music producers, a man who had discovered superstars. But a personal tragedy years ago had made him walk away from it all. He now lived a quiet life, his heart closed off to the industry that had given him everything and then taken it away. But in the twins' music, he heard something he thought was long dead pure, unadulterated soul. "You too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have a gift." Lena looked at Leo, then back at the man, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Strangers were usually a source of danger, not compliments. "Where are your parents?" Tunda asked gently. Leo's face hardened. "We don't have any." Tunde saw the lie and the truth in those 4 words. He saw the fierce protectiveness in Leo's eyes and the deep-seated hurt in Lena's. He didn't press. Instead, he did something that defied all logic for a man who had sworn off the world of music. He made an offer. "I have a small house not far from here," he said. "It's warm. There's food. You can stay for a night, just to get out of the rain." The twins exchanged a look. Their instincts screamed, no, but their shivering bodies and empty stomachs screamed yes. "There's a competition," Tunde continued, seeing their hesitation. "It's called National Star, a talent show. The biggest in the country. With your talent, you could win. It could change your lives." The words hung in the air, a wild, impossible promise. Lena's eyes lit up with a spark of the dreamer she was. Leo, the realist, remained suspicious. "Why would you help us?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Tunde looked at the 2 children, so small and so broken, yet radiating a talent so immense it was almost blinding. He thought of his own daughter, who he had lost, a singer whose voice had been silenced too soon. "Because," Tunde said, his voice cracking slightly, "someone once helped me. And because music like yours doesn't deserve to die in the rain." He stood up and held out his hand, not in a command, but in an invitation. After a long, silent moment, Leo looked at Lena. She gave the smallest of nods. And together, they took the man's hand, stepping out of the storm and into a future they couldn't possibly have imagined. Tunde's home was nothing like the 1-room apartment they had shared with their mother, nor was it a grand mansion. It was a small, neat bungalow filled with the quiet ghosts of a life once lived. Bookshelves overflowed with poetry, and a grand piano, its wood polished but lid closed, sat in the corner of the living room like a sleeping giant. For the first time in weeks, Leo and Lena slept in real beds, under clean sheets, without the fear of being chased away. The next morning, Tunde didn't treat them like a charity case. He treated them like artists. "Your voice." "Lena," he said, as they sat around his small kitchen table eating hot akara, "it's a raw diamond. Beautiful, but it needs polishing. Your breathing, your control. We can work on that." He then turned to Leo. And you, young man, your melodies are the heart of this. They speak a language that everyone understands, but they need structure. A beginning, a middle, an end. The days that followed were a whirlwind of training. Tunde, the retired maestro, found his old passion reigniting. He taught Lena breathing exercises, scales, and how to channel her pain into power, not just sorrow. He sat with Leo at the old piano, his fingers, once dormant, now dancing across the keys, showing the boy how chords and harmonies could build a world. The twins were fast learners, soaking up his knowledge like dry earth soaking up the first rain. They were not just singing for survival anymore. They were learning the craft. A week later, they stood in a long, snaking queue outside the National Theater, the venue for the National Star auditions. The air was electric with nervous energy. The other contestants were a dazzling, intimidating sight. Girls in sequined bonnet dresses, boys with perfectly styled hair, dance troupes in matching outfits. And then there were Leo and Lena, in clean but simple clothes Tunde had bought them from a local market. Look at them, a girl with bright pink lipstick sneered, nudging her friend. Did they wander in from the village? Another boy laughed. They probably think this is a church choir audition. Lena's shoulders slumped, her newfound confidence wavering. Leo instinctively put a protective arm around her. Don't listen to them, he whispered, his own heart pounding. We're not here for them. When their number was finally called, they walked onto the massive, brightly lit stage. The three judges, all famous figures in the Nigerian music industry, looked down at them with expressions ranging from boredom to mild curiosity. The audience was a sea of shadowy figures. And who do we have here? Asked the lead judge, a notoriously harsh critic named BC. I'm Lena, and this is my brother Leo, Lena said, her voice small in the vast auditorium. We're just Leo and Lena. BC raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. All right. Leo and Lena. What do you have for us? Leo looked at Lena and gave a small nod. He brought the silver harmonica to his lips. A single, clear note cut through the silence. It was a haunting melody, the one he had composed the night they were cast out. Then, Lena began to sing. Her voice, no longer just a raw, emotional cry, was now a finely tuned instrument. It soared through the auditorium, filled with the pain of 1,000 rainy nights, but also with a defiant, unbreakable hope. She sang of loss, of abandonment, of a love that was supposed to protect, but instead had broken them. The lyrics were simple, direct, and devastatingly honest. Mama. The door is closed now. The rain is cold and loud. But I hear a song in the thunder, a whisper in the cloud. Something happened in that room. The bored expressions on the judges' faces melted away. BC, the harsh critic, leaned forward, her pen forgotten on the table. In the audience, the snickering stopped. A profound, reverent silence fell over the hall. People weren't just listening to a song. They were witnessing a testimony. The twins weren't performing. They were bleeding their story onto the stage. When the last note of the harmonica faded away, the silence held for a beat, then another. It was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Then, a woman in the third row began to sob openly. BC, the judge, slowly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. She tried to speak, but her voice was choked. She cleared her throat. "In all my years on this show," she finally said, her voice thick with an emotion no one had ever heard from her before, "I have never, ever been so moved." She looked at the other judges, who were equally stunned. "That wasn't an audition," she said, looking back at the twins. "That was a masterpiece." The audience erupted. It wasn't just applause, it was a standing ovation, a roar of approval and empathy that washed over the two small figures on stage. A video of their performance, filmed on a shaky phone by someone in the audience, was uploaded to the internet that night. By the next morning, it had 1 million views. By evening, it had 5 million. The headlines were everywhere. Street twins stun national star judges. The song that made Nigeria weep. The story of the Oshodi twins had gone viral. They were no longer invisible. The entire nation now knew their names. And somewhere, in a dingy canteen, a woman named Maria was wiping down a table when she looked up at the small television in the corner and saw the faces of the children she had thrown away. Maria dropped the wet rag. It landed with a soft, unnoticed splash on the grimy floor. Her eyes were glued to the small, flickering television. There they were, her children. Not as she remembered them, small, scared, and tear-stained, but on a grand stage, bathed in golden light. Lena's face, once thin with hunger, was now radiant. And Leo, her quiet, watchful son, stood beside his sister, his harmonica glinting. Their music filled the noisy canteen, and for a moment, everything stopped. A wave of emotions, complex and contradictory, crashed over Maria. First, a flicker of pride. "Those are my children. I gave them that voice." But it was immediately swallowed by a sharp, stabbing guilt. She remembered their small faces in the rain, the finality of the bolt sliding shut. The guilt was quickly chased by something else, something ugly and opportunistic. She saw the headlines flashing at the bottom of the screen: "Nation falls in love with street orphans." Orphans, the word twisted in her gut. "They're not orphans," she muttered, a dangerous idea forming. "They have a mother." Over the next few days, Leo and Lena's lives were transformed. Tunda shielded them from the media storm, but their story was too compelling. They were moved to a secure apartment rented by the show's producers. For the first time, they had their own rooms. But the sudden fame was overwhelming. It was during this whirlwind that Maria made her move. She spent 2 days borrowing money, buying a decent dress, and rehearsing her story. She showed up at the gates of the television studio, her face a perfect symphony of maternal anguish. "I'm their mother," she cried to the reporters who were permanently camped outside. "I've been searching for them. They ran away from home." The story was explosive. The narrative of the brave, abandoned orphans was suddenly thrown into question. The media went into a frenzy. The next day, the producers arranged a family reunion for the cameras. Maria was led into a cold conference room. When Leo and Lena walked in, she stood up, arms open, tears streaming down her face. "My babies. Oh, thank God. I've found you." Lena froze. A storm of confusion and a desperate, childish hope warred within her. She wanted to believe. She wanted to run into her mother's arms. But she looked at Leo. His eyes were cold as stone. He remembered the rain. He remembered the locked door. He remembered the words, I wish you were never born." He pulled his sister slightly behind him. "We didn't run away," he said, his voice quiet but unwavering. "You threw us out." Maria's performance didn't falter. She let out a heart-wrenching sob. "Oh, my son, you were so angry. You're twisting things. I would never. I love you both more than life itself." The producers and social workers watched, their faces a mixture of confusion and pity. It was an unfair fight. The show decided on a compromise to quell the public outcry. They would allow Maria to be part of their journey on the show, presenting a story of a family healing. Publicly, they were a picture of reconciliation. Privately, the twins felt trapped. I think she's really sorry," Lena whispered to Leo one night. She wanted so desperately for it to be true. Leo looked at his sister, his heart aching for her innocence. He reached into his pocket, his fingers wrapping around the old silver harmonica. It wasn't just a musical instrument anymore. It was a keeper of secrets. Maybe," he said, his voice soft but his eyes sharp. "But we have to be careful. Lena, we have to be very, very careful." He knew something she didn't. He knew that the line between a mother's love and a manipulator's greed was dangerously thin. And he suspected his mother had crossed it a long, long time ago. The supervised visits were a special kind of torture. They took place in a sterile, personality-less room at the TV studio, with a child psychologist observing from behind a one-way mirror. Maria would arrive, her eyes red from what seemed like endless crying, bringing them small gifts, a meat pie, a bottle of Fanta things she could never have afforded before, likely bought with the money the TV station was now paying her for exclusive interviews. She would try to hug them, her arms wrapping around them in a gesture that felt both desperate and hollow. Lena, ever the hopeful one, would accept the hugs, her small body stiff and uncertain. She wanted to believe, to feel the warmth of the mother she missed. But the memory of that rainy night was a cold barrier between them. Leo, however, was a wall of silent resistance. He would sit with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on a point just over his mother's shoulder, answering her questions with single, clipped words. "How are you sleeping?" my son Maria would ask, her voice dripping with concern. "Fine. Are they feeding you well here?" "Yes." He never accepted her gifts. He never met her eyes. His quiet, unyielding rejection was more powerful than any outburst. He was waiting, watching. And Maria, for all her practiced performance, was growing frustrated. She had expected to win them over, to repair the public narrative. But Leo was an immovable object. Meanwhile, Tunda was a man on a mission. The gentle, retired producer had transformed into a tenacious investigator. "She's a liar, and I won't let her destroy these children's lives a second time," he told his old friend, a seasoned journalist named Segun. Tunde started where it all began, the cramped, "face me, I face you" compound where Maria had lived. The landlord, a stout man with suspicious eyes, was initially reluctant to talk. "I don't want any trouble," he'd grumbled. But Tunde was persistent. He didn't offer money. He offered a chance for the truth to be heard. He spoke of the twins, of their talent, of the lie their mother was now peddling on national television. Slowly, the landlord's defenses crumbled. She was a troubled woman, he finally admitted, sighing, always complaining, always broke. The night I asked her to leave, she was behind on rent for 3 months. I gave her warnings, That night, I heard shouting. I looked through my window. I saw it all. She threw those poor children out into the storm like they were garbage. Tunde's heart pounded. Would you be willing to say that on record? The landlord hesitated, but then he nodded. For those children, yes. What she's doing now is a bigger sin than owing rent. Tunde found a similar story with the neighbors. An elderly woman who sold provisions next door remembered seeing the twins huddled in the alley the next morning. I gave them bread, she said, her voice trembling. They looked like frightened birds. Their own mother did that to them. It is a wicked world. The pieces were coming together, but Tunde needed something more, something undeniable. He needed to find the children's father. Maria had always been vague about him, claiming he was a musician who had traveled abroad and lost contact. It was another lie. Tunde used his old industry contacts, calling in favors from people he hadn't spoken to in years. He described the man Maria had once been with, a charming, irresponsible guitarist named David. After a week of dead ends, he got a call. I found him. Segun, the journalist, said, "He's not abroad. He's playing at a small hotel bar in Ibadan." Tunde drove to Ibadan that very night. He found David plucking lazy tunes on an old guitar, his face etched with the story of a life lived on the margins. He looked older than his years, a ghost of the charming man Maria had once fallen for. When Tunde approached him and showed him a picture of the twins, David's hand stilled on the guitar strings. I didn't know," he stammered, his eyes wide with shock. "She told me she lost the pregnancy. She said she never wanted to see me again." "She lied," Tunde said simply. "And now she's lying to the whole country, trying to ruin the only chance your children have ever had." David's face crumpled with a grief and guilt that had been buried for a decade. He wasn't a monster, just a weak man who had run from responsibility. But now, seeing the faces of the children he never knew he had, something inside him shifted. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Back in Lagos." The pressure on Leo and Lena was mounting. The semi-finals were approaching, and the cloud of scandal was affecting their ability to rehearse. Lena would often burst into tears, confused and hurt. Leo grew quieter, more withdrawn, his only solace the harmonica he now carried everywhere. During one particularly difficult visit, Maria tried a new tactic. She brought a legal document. "This is for you to sign," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It just says that you want to live with your mother. It will help clear things up with the show." Lena reached for the paper, but Leo snatched it first. He didn't read it. He just looked at his mother, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "No," he said. "Leo, don't be difficult." "I said no," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "We're not signing anything." Maria stared at her son, shocked by the force of his defiance. The little boy she had dismissed as weak and pliable was now looking at her with the eyes of a man who would not be broken. She didn't know that Leo was no longer just protecting his sister. He was setting his own trap. The night before the semifinals, the entire nation was on edge. The story of the Oshodi twins had become a national obsession, a live-action drama playing out on every screen. Maria, having failed to get the twins to sign her document, had gone on a popular morning show, weeping uncontrollably. "My son is confused," she cried. "He's being manipulated by people who want to use my children's talent for their own gain. I'm just a poor mother who wants her family back." Her performance was convincing, and the tide of public sympathy began to turn in her favor. People started questioning Tunde's motives. Hashtags like #BringTheTwins home and #BelieveMaria started trending. The producers of National Star were in panic mode. "This is a disaster," Mr. Ade said, pacing in his office. "If they go on stage tomorrow and the public is turned against them, we're finished. We have to do something." Tunde sat calmly across from him. "I agree," he said. "We do." He placed a small, unmarked USB stick on the producer's polished desk. "This is an exclusive for your network. Air it tonight, during the primetime news. Trust me." Mr. Ade looked at the USB stick, then at Tunde's unshakable calm. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. That evening, just as the 8 o'clock news began, the regularly scheduled program was interrupted. "We have a breaking update on the developing story of the National Star contestants. Leo and Lena," the news anchor said, her expression grave. What followed was a bombshell. The screen cut to a professionally shot video. The first face was the landlord's. "I saw her with my own eyes," he said, his voice clear and steady. "She screamed at them, called them burdens, and pushed them into the pouring rain. She locked the door on her own children." The screen cut again. The elderly provision seller. "They came to me the next morning, shivering and hungry. They had nothing. She never came looking for them, not once." Then, the final, devastating blow. A man with a tired, guilt-ridden face appeared on screen. It was David, their father. "My name is David," he said, his voice shaking. "And I am Leo and Lena's father. I left a long time ago, a mistake I will regret for the rest of my life. But Maria, she told me she lost the pregnancy. She took my children away from me. Now she is trying to take them away from their future." He looked directly into the camera. "Please, don't let her lies win. Those children have suffered enough." The video ended, returning to the stunned news anchor. The truth, raw and undeniable, had been laid bare. Maria, watching from her hotel room, saw her carefully constructed world of lies shatter into a million pieces. Her phone began to ring. A torrent of calls from reporters, from the show's producers, from family members she hadn't spoken to in years. She didn't answer. She just stared at her own reflection in the dark television screen. A reflection she no longer recognized. The public backlash was instantaneous and brutal. The hashtags flipped, "Justice for Leo" and "Lena, cancel Maria." The woman who had been a symbol of maternal suffering just hours before was now the nation's most despised villain. The producers of National Star immediately issued a statement, banning Maria from the studio premises and offering a public apology to the twins for the emotional distress caused. The path to the semi-finals was now clear. But Leo and Lena, watching the news from their apartment with Tunde, felt no joy. Lena was crying softly, not for herself, but for the mother she now knew was truly lost to them. Leo sat beside her, his arm around her, his face grim. The victory felt bitter. "She's all alone now," Lena whispered. "She chose to be," Leo replied, though his voice lacked its usual hardness. He looked at Tunde. "Will they still let us perform tomorrow?" Tunde placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "Tomorrow," he said, "you won't just be performing. You'll be telling the final chapter of your story. and the whole world will be listening. The next day, as they prepared to go on stage, a nervous production assistant handed Leo a small, crumpled note. It had been left at the gate by a woman who refused to give her name. Leo opened it. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. "I am sorry. For everything, Mama." He folded the note and put it in his pocket, his expression unreadable. Lena looked at him, her eyes questioning. He just shook his head. It was time. As the stage lights came up and the host announced their names, a hush fell over the audience. They weren't just contestants anymore. They were survivors, and they were about to give the performance of their lives. The stage was bathed in a soft, blue light, creating an atmosphere of hushed reverence. The audience, both in the theater and the millions watching at home, held a collective breath. They had followed the drama, seen the news, and now they were waiting for the resolution, for the music that had started this entire journey. Leo and Lena walked to the center of the stage, hand in hand. They looked small against the vast backdrop. Two tiny figures who had weathered a storm of public opinion. Lena wore a simple white dress, her hair braided with small, delicate flowers. Leo was in a neat, dark shirt and trousers. They looked nothing like the polished, sequined performers who had come before them. They looked real. There were no backing dancers, no flashy pyrotechnics, just two microphones and a stool for Leo. The lead judge, BC, who had been their staunchest supporter from the beginning, looked at them with an expression of profound empathy. "Leo, Lena," she said, her voice soft. "The stage is yours." Lena stepped up to her microphone, her eyes scanning the dark, faceless audience. For a moment, she seemed to hesitate, her small hand clutching the mic stand. Then she looked at Leo. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. He sat on the stool and brought the silver harmonica to his lips. But this time, he didn't start with a haunting melody. He spoke. "Before we sing," he said, his voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the theater, "I want to say something." He paused, and the silence was absolute. "Everyone thinks they know our story. The story of the kids who were thrown out, the kids who sang on the street, the kids whose mother lied." He took a breath, his gaze unwavering. "But that's not the whole story, because before all of that, we were just her children, and she was just our mom." A wave of emotion rippled through the audience. This wasn't the angry, defiant speech they had expected. This was something else entirely. This song. Leo continued, his voice cracking just slightly, "is not about hate. It's not about revenge. It's for her." He brought the harmonica to his lips, and this time, the notes that flowed out were different. They weren't just sad. They were filled with a complex, heartbreaking beauty. It was a melody of love and loss, of innocence and pain, all woven together. Then Lena began to sing, her voice, now a powerful, controlled instrument, filled the auditorium. The song was a ballad, slow and poignant. Leo had written it in the dark, quiet hours of the past few days. It was called Mama's Lullaby. The lyrics were a devastatingly simple narrative of their lives. The first verse spoke of a mother's warm hands, of bedtime stories and whispered songs. The second verse shifted, the music turning minor, as she sang of a love that grew cold, of a door that closed, of a world that turned gray. "Mama, you sang the sun to sleep, You promised dawn would come, but you left us in the midnight, with a song that had no drum. The camera panned to the judges. All three were weeping silently. In the audience, people were holding each other. Strangers united in a shared moment of heartbreak and catharsis. The performance was more than a song. It was an act of grace. In the face of betrayal, they weren't screaming in anger. They were whispering in forgiveness. The final verse was the most powerful. The melody lifted, a fragile, hopeful crescendo, as Lena's voice swelled with a strength that seemed impossible for a child her age. And if you hear this lullaby on some cold and lonely night, know your children still remember how you taught them to find light. The last note of the harmonica hung in the air, a single, shimmering tear of sound, before fading into absolute silence. No one moved. No one clapped. The entire theater was frozen, captivated, and utterly broken. Then, slowly, as if waking from a dream, a single person stood up and began to clap. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet. The applause, a deafening, thunderous wave of emotion. It wasn't just applause for a performance. It was for their resilience, their courage, their astonishing capacity to forgive. Leo and Lena stood on stage, hand in hand, tears finally streaming down their own faces. They had taken their deepest pain and turned it into the most beautiful art. They had faced their monster not with a sword, but with a song. And in doing so, they had won more than just a competition. They had won back their own hearts. The final vote wasn't even a contest. The phone lines were flooded with a record-breaking number of votes, nearly all of them for Leo and Lena. When the host opened the golden envelope and announced their names as the winners of National Star, the celebration was ecstatic, but also deeply emotional. Confetti rained down on the stage as the twins were engulfed in hugs from the judges, the crew, and even their former competitors. Tunde stood at the side of the stage, his face a portrait of overwhelming pride, tears streaming freely down his cheeks. He had found them in the rain, and now he was watching them stand in a shower of gold. The grand prize was 50 million naira, a record deal, and a brand new SUV. But as they stood on stage, clutching the oversized check, their eyes weren't on the prize. They were scanning the wings, looking for the one person who wasn't there. After the whirlwind of press interviews and congratulations, Tunde escorted them to a quiet, private room backstage. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on the door. Tunde opened it. It was Maria. She looked small and broken, her face pale and her eyes swollen. The arrogant, angry woman who had thrown her children out was gone, replaced by a ghost hollowed out by shame. She didn't try to hug them this time. She just stood at the doorway, her hands clutching a small, worn handbag. Lena was the first to move. She walked slowly towards her mother, her expression unreadable. Leo stayed back, his hand still protectively on his harmonica. "Mama," Lena said, her voice quiet. Maria flinched at the word, as if it were a physical blow. "I saw," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "I saw the show. Your song." She couldn't finish. She broke down, her body racked with sobs of pure, undiluted regret. "I am so sorry," she cried, sinking to her knees. "I was a monster. I don't deserve you. I don't deserve anything." Lena knelt in front of her. She didn't hug her. She just looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw not a villain, but a deeply broken woman. A woman who had been so consumed by her own pain that she had inflicted it on the two people she should have loved the most. "We forgive you," Lena said softly. Maria's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Leo walked over and stood beside his sister. He didn't speak, but he nodded, confirming Lena's words. "It doesn't mean we can go back," Leo said, his voice gentle but firm. "Too much has been broken, but we don't hate you. We have to heal now." The forgiveness was not an absolution. It was a release. They were releasing her from their anger, and in doing so, they were releasing themselves. Maria continued to weep, but these were different tears. They were the first painful tears of a long road toward her own healing. A month later, Leo and Lena were living with Tunde, not as guests, but as family. He had officially started the adoption process. Their new home was filled with music. The grand piano was no longer silent. Leo played it every day, composing melodies that were now filled with a quiet, hopeful joy. Lena's voice was the sound that woke the house in the morning and soothed it to sleep at night. Their father, David, after several long, difficult conversations with Tunde and a child psychologist, was slowly being introduced into their lives. He visited on weekends, bringing not expensive gifts, but his old guitar. He would sit with Leo, the two of them working out chords, a father and son connecting through the shared language of music. The road was long, and the trust was fragile, but it was a start. Maria used a small portion of the money the TV station had paid her to rent a room in a different city. She started attending therapy and found a quiet job cleaning at a local church. She sent letters to the twins, not asking for anything, just sharing small pieces of her day, her thoughts, her slow journey back to herself. They read every one. The story of the Oshodi twins became a legend, a modern folktale of resilience and grace. But for Leo and Lena, it was just their life. They had faced the deepest darkness and had found the light, not through revenge, but through their art and their astonishing capacity to forgive. One evening, as they sat on the porch with Tunde, watching the sunset paint the sky, Lena began to hum a new, cheerful melody. Leo picked it up on his harmonica, adding a soft, soaring harmony. The music was no longer about survival. It was about life.